In East Africa, Kenya is working to safeguard its income and eliminate recurring budget deficits. This is supported by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, which has been advocating for regulated expenditure and restructuring of loss-making state companies for some time. The fund, which plans to disperse millions to finance the country's budgets in the next weeks, said rigorous spending management and the formulation of a medium-term income strategy will assist and underpin deficit reduction in the years ahead. It also emphasized the significance of keeping the reform momentum going in order to address financial issues at state-owned firms like Kenya Airways and Kenya Power. The IMF has approved Kenya's recent taxation of vital commodities and services such as cooking gas and bank loan fees, claiming that the extra money received has helped to offset increasing fuel and fertilizer costs in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis. Kenya will access $244 million, bringing the total IMF support in a 38-month financing facility to $1.17 billion under the Extended Fund Facility and Extended Credit Facility. Now, in the midst of this, President Uhuru Kenyatta has announced a 12% increase for the minimum wage. Kenyans have been grappling with a surge in prices of commodities caused by the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Today, we look at how Kenya is taking on inflation and its budget deficits. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulokwe Adelaru Balogun. And joining me now from Nairobi, Kenya, is Ken Gitinga. He's the Chief Economist, Mentoria Economics. Ken, welcome back to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me once again.
Many thanks. Thanks for having me, Tolulupe.
So let's start with what is probably some of the more exciting news for many Kenyans right now, and that's the announcement of a new minimum wage. And it's often celebrated as a good thing, but we also know that when minimum wage goes up, the cost of everyday essential items also tends to rise. But I'll start with this. How much of this is a political decision versus an economic one, given that presidential and parliamentary elections are just a few months away?
Well, I think it's both a political decision and an economic decision. There hasn't been any increase in wages since 2018, and inflation has been eroding the purchasing power of most Kenyans. Now, that particular presidential directive was targeting the minimum wage, which is around about $116, really to cushion people who are earning the least. And of course, as you say, it's coming also during an election year, and it's incumbent that people are protected from the high cost of living. So I think it was a mix of both politics and economics.
But how much protection does this 12% increase actually afford? So as you said, the monthly minimum wage will now go from 13,500 Kenyan shillings, around $116, to 15,120 shillings, which is around $130. But we know that the Central Organization of Trade Unions of Kenya had actually demanded a 24% increase. So does 12% really hit the mark? Does it do something?
Actually, what the trade union had advocated for was a 42% when they were beginning the discussions. They later came down to 23%, and eventually what the government was able to provide was 12%. You're right, that means that's about a 3,200 shillings increment, about $32. It might not sound like much, but definitely it will go a long way in being able to particularly shield people from the high cost of food and high cost of transport in the city. I think moving forward, and also we have to remember that all this is happening within the IMF context in which Kenya is supposed to be reducing spending and not increasing spending. So I think from that perspective, Kenyans reluctantly accepted that offer, given that nothing has come over the last 3 years. But by all means, we should expect further clamor for more, particularly once the new administration comes in.
And as you mentioned, of course, the IMF conversation, and it was last year that Kenya agreed to freeze about 82 billion shillings of a salary increment for civil servants for 2 years, and that was meant to keep pay unchanged until 2025 in a deal that the country had signed with the IMF. So how does this wage increase now affect that? Because that was particularly targeting Kenyan civil servants.
It did come up during that Labor Day event on Sunday when the KOTU, the trade unions, actually cast some stones at the Salaries and Remunerations Commission. They said when that commission was founded, it was only meant to be an advisory commission that was supposed to just advise. But all of a sudden, it has morphed and it actually has become the organ that sets salaries for the public service. So that did come up, and there was that plea to the president to return that commission to become an advisory and not a setup. But I think from a broader perspective, it puts the government at a difficult place because on the left hand, they're trying to follow the IMF requirements for them to get the next round of funding. About $244 million is up to be released in the next few weeks, but this can only happen if the conditions are, the IMF conditions are met. But obviously, the push and pull by the Kenyan citizens, the cost of living has become a big issue, not least on social media. So the government is trying to balance a very tightrope to try and at least appease both sides.
All right, so we know, as you said earlier, that Kenya has actually been under the hammer in terms of reducing the size of government and the cost of governance as well as the government's wage bill. But now with this minimum wage increase, there's going to be some knockdown effect. So where's the money going to come from? Is this going to come in a way from some of the loans? What does Kenya intend to do in order for whether it's state-owned enterprises or private enterprises, whoever needs to pay this minimum wage, to be able to do so?
They haven't been super clear about that, but one would expect there will be some cuts in some dockets that maybe are considered non-essential, and some of those cuts, that savings could be plugged in to allow this increment. So obviously, I think the Treasury mandarins will do the calculations behind the scenes. Possibly, we could find some areas where there could be huge budgetary cuts, and that money could be reallocated. But so far, they have not publicly stated this sort of like the fiscal strategy of how that will become possible. Possibly, they would want to prevent a fallout, but one would expect some of the programs they're doing with the higher education. There's been a huge rationalization happening in higher education. There's been a huge effort around KQ, Kenya Power. So one would expect some of those budget cuts behind the scenes what will fund this initiative.
All right, so let's look at inflation and where it has put Kenya and Kenyans right now. So inflation hit a 7-month high of 6.4% in April, up from 5.56% in March and then 5.76% in April of last year. And the president has said that the high cost of living is due to factors beyond my control, such as the coronavirus pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But we can see from all the data that the economic issues of Kenya have been flagged for a while, even predating the crisis, both of these crises. Living costs and food were flagged before the Russia-Ukraine crisis and even before COVID. Was there anything that could have been done to somehow find a way to keep a hedge on inflation, even when we take into consideration the crisis that have now hit the global economy back to back in the past 2-3 years now?
Well, that seems to be where the debate has largely been anchored on. There are those who look at it from the president's perspective and purely blame international events, the COVID pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, sort of as the origin of the high cost of living. Then there are the others who largely are led by the deputy president, who talk about Kenya's borrowing, which has been quite large over the last few years, even before the pandemic, and how that has led to our public debt getting out of hand and requiring the government to put very high taxes on the cost of living. So if you look at fuel, for example, almost 46% of what you pay at the pump is going towards taxes. I think in the grand scheme of things, both of them are correct. There have been those international events, but also our taxation rate, which has been driven by our high public debt, I think is also a contributor to the high cost of living. So we could say that this has been a fusion of both global events and domestic events, which has really put Kenyans in the eye of the storm.
Mm-hmm. All right, Ken, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get more into the IMF recommendations and the issues with the budget deficits as well, and see what progress Kenya may have been making on structural reforms and also bringing things down a little bit when it comes to the deficit. So do hold the line. You're watching Business Edge, and the conversation is on Kenya dealing with the high rates of inflation and, of course, budget deficits, as the IMF is ready to release around $244 million in some form of relief. The conversation will continue after this. Still with me from Nairobi, Kenya, is Ken Gichinga. He's the chief economist, Mentoria Economics, and we're looking at Kenya as the country looks to deal with its inflation and budget deficits. Now, while East Africa's largest economy is dealing with inflation by raising minimum wage, there's also the issue of budget deficits that again predates COVID and the current war in the Ukraine. There was minus 6.91%, minus 7.39%, and minus 8.1% for budget deficits in 2018, 2019, and 2020, respectively. And beyond the larger debt conversation that Kenya is having, why has the country struggled to manage its budget deficit? So, Ken, I put the question to you, beyond the conversation around debt, why is budget deficit such a difficult thing for Kenya seemingly to master?
It never used to be a difficult thing. If you look at during the regime of the late President Mwai Kibaki, particularly at the beginning of his term, we used to run balanced budgets. But over time, there has been that big infrastructure push, and much of that infrastructure has been driven by debt. There has been that argument, particularly from government proponents, that you have two types of expenditures. You have recurrent expenditures, this is your salaries to teachers, to doctors. Then you have development expenditures. And what they argue is what the tax collection in Kenya is only able to do is to pay for the recurrent. This is salaries, rent. But if you want to see development, then we have to borrow. So that has been the narrative, that if you want to see development, you have to see nice roads, infrastructure, you need to have some level of borrowing being infused into that. I think what maybe Kenyans have a problem with is that level of borrowing has significantly gone up. Project costs have significantly gone up. To just look at the Nairobi Expressway, it was budgeted to be at about 60 billion shillings. And as we speak, it's already gone up to 88 billion shillings. And a lot of people don't understand why projects tend to be overpriced, overcosted, and such. So I think that has been the debate around that issue of the budget deficit.
Okay. On top of that, when you look at it in terms of this conversation around development and versus recurrence, do you think in particular for Kenya, taking on this amount of debt as much as the country has in recent years, has it been worth it?
First of all, that definition, that distinction that we have between recurrence and development expenditure, I particularly find it an unnecessary distinction. It's often used by policy makers to make that distinction. But I always have a problem with that distinction, because I argue when you pay the salary of the doctor and that doctor is able to treat your patient and that patient is able to go back to work and be productive, then that is both a recurrent and a development. When you pay the salary of a teacher and that teacher imparts knowledge on a student and that student is able to open a business and create jobs, that is both recurrent and development. So I think that distinction has been problematic, particularly for me. But from the broader perspective, infrastructure is needed in a country. I don't think any economist can deny that. Infrastructure helps to build efficiencies. But I think the challenge we've had in Kenya is the projects sometimes don't generate the cash flows to be able to pay themselves back. If you look at the standard gauge railway, which is the largest of them all, it's still struggling to be able to raise enough revenue to pay for the loans from the Chinese. If you look at most of the highways that have been constructed by the Chinese, still the revenue generation is not enough to service the loan. So I think the challenge has been on those, maybe how we prioritize projects. I think some projects have lagged a bit in terms of economic progress, and possibly that's why we find ourselves with massive projects, but very little cash flow.
Okay, so let's come back now to the IMF and the World Bank. And for a number of years, they've made recommendations on structural reforms that they think Kenya should embark on, with a focus particularly on taxation. So now there's a 16% charge on cooking gas, a 20% excise duty on airtime and data, which rose from 15%, a 20% duty on fees and commissions made on loads, and a 7.5% tax on gaming profits, among other taxing measures. And this seems to sort of have been the answer or the steps that the IMF was looking for from Kenya. But in regards to how all of this has gone down with Kenyans, how has it been? Because as you talked about earlier, with the increase in taxation, you've seen rising living costs and harder things for Kenyans as well. So how has it gone down?
It's gone down very badly because not only have people lost jobs during COVID, some people have faced also salary cuts, and at the same time, they're facing higher cost of cooking oil, higher cost of gas, higher cost of bread. So it's leading people to live impossible lives. People are struggling. Issues around mental health have become far too common. So to answer your question, it has been a disaster in the making. Well, the IMF is correct in saying that we do need to increase our revenues. I think the suggestions they have put forward on what it called consumption taxes, excise tax, VAT, things that touch on everyday commodities, I think those were ill-advised. What they would have gone for is the sectors where they can raise revenue without touching particularly on the ordinary common man. So the idea that Kenya can generate more revenue is true, but I think the means the IMF has prescribed, I think, has been largely unsound.
So why hasn't Kenya pushed back? Because this is not just only something that Kenya has gone through. We see these same types of recommendations for a number of African economies when we know what the poverty situation is in many economies. And then it also brings back the days of SAP, the structural adjustment programs, that still have very, very bad memories for many economies. So why didn't Russia, I beg your pardon, not Russia, why didn't Kenya push back on this?
Well, that's a question I think we've been asking for a long time, particularly given that all that I've said is in the public domain around really people's experiences in and out of the city. I think there are a number of reasons. I think possibly people have a huge deference to the IMF. I think people believe sometimes those are the necessary recommendations. And I think also people, they maybe are not aware of alternatives of getting to the same place without placing such a high pain to many Kenyans. So I think it's maybe just lack of understanding, maybe the fundamentals of economics, what are the alternatives, and also maybe just that maybe carrot and stick approach used by the IMF, particularly on third world countries.
All right, so the IMF also flagged the conversations and issues around state-owned enterprises. Kenya Airways is going to receive about 36.6 billion shillings again, another bailout this year. Kenya Power as well, also heavily indebted, will likely also receive a bailout. And people are concerned that the same situation you see with Eskom in South Africa will replicate itself with Kenya Power continuously having money funneled into it, but it becomes a loss-making entity and enterprise. So particularly in terms of that, how does Kenya solve the issues of its state-owned enterprises?
And it's very interesting you raise that question, because if you look at what you call classical IMF economics, is that if the state cannot do it, let it be privatized. And that has been the theme, particularly in the 90s, where we had the Kenya Post and Telecommunications, which was very ineffective, and it was in classical IMF fashion, split up. Some segments were privatized. You had the rise of Safaricom, which eventually became the most profitable company in East and Central Africa. So that has been classical IMF economics with its pros and cons. But what you're seeing of late right now, what you just described with KQ, it's quite unusual. It's quite un-IMF for them to continue recommending that huge amounts of public funds be put into these state enterprises and just allow them to continue being as they have been, loss-making and really not delivering the kind of value they expect. So in a way, it shows you also the IMF's positions to these things. Its ideological position has changed. It's moved away from privatize, and now it's becoming a bit more ambiguous, where you're saying, let's bail out and bail out and bail out. So it also becomes unclear sometimes what the long-term goals, particularly of IMF recommendations, are given what I've just said.
And that raises a lot of questions. So finally, Ken, before I let you go, according to the IMF again, Kenya's economy is expected to grow by around 5.7% in 2022. And that this is because the country has also been able to contain some of the aftershocks of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're not sure how long the Russia-Ukraine crisis will last, but we know that the effects are being felt. And even if it ends tomorrow, those effects will continue to be felt for a number of months. Do you think this 5.7% growth in 2022 is a good starting place for the country?
Sometimes you have to look at the quality of the growth and not the quantity. That growth has been coming from the public sector in terms of infrastructure development. I think what Kenyans are asking for is to have more money in their pockets. And what they mean is it's time to have the private sector contribute to growth. Because yes, the numbers can look good on paper, but if they're just coming from infrastructure investments, the only people who really benefit from them are the Chinese contractors. I think what more people are asking for is, can we see more private sector growth? That even if it's 4%, but it's being driven by the private sector, then that money trickles faster to ordinary homes and ordinary households. I think that's number one. Number two, in that IMF report you just quoted, they talk about Kenya's links to Russia and Ukraine being quite limited. I actually beg to differ, because we import quite a bit of wheat, for example, from Russia and Ukraine. Our fertilizer, Ukraine is the largest exporter of potash. So our fertilizers largely depend on events in Ukraine, and even tourism. We have been getting quite a number of tourists from that part of the world. So I would say the linkages are not as insignificant as maybe what the IMF report suggested, and that if that war is elongated, we might actually see further increases in things like fertilizer, cooking oil, sunflower. Ukraine is the largest exporter of sunflower oil and just normal regular oil. So those events, I think, will still continue to dominate in as we build our investment thesis.
All right. Ken, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And we'll continue to keep an eye on how the largest economy in East Africa is doing. But a few questions were raised. Will this 12% minimum wage increase do enough to hedge some of the inflation that Kenyans are feeling? And also, with the ambiguity in what the IMF is recommending, is it time for African countries to look away from the Bretton Woods institutions? It's conversations that will continue right here on Business Edge. This, of course, is the Business Show right here on News Central. Up next is NC4 to watch. And for the few stories we're keeping our eyes on, we start here in West Africa, where Total Energies has announced plans to sell its minority stake in an onshore oil-producing partnership in Nigeria. This would be the latest divestment of Nigerian oil assets by an international major. The company is looking to offload 10% interest in a firm that holds 20 onshore and shallow water permits in Nigeria. On the Nairobi Securities Exchange, more foreign investors are cashing out, currently dumping a further 1.7 billion Kenyan shillings worth of stocks in April 2022. This brings the year-to-date net selling position to 3.4 billion Kenyan shillings as foreign investors continue to ditch frontier markets for safe haven investments. Last month, the portfolio outflows were the highest this year on a month-over-month basis and equaled exits through the first quarter to March. South Africa's electricity company Eskom has announced that it implemented stage 2 load shedding from 5 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon until Monday, May the 9th, due to severe generation capacity constraints after 9 generators broke down. And finally, oil rose as industry data pointed to a drop in U.S. stockpiles and traders braced for possible European Union curbs on Russian crude. WTI for June delivery added 1.2% to $103.59 a barrel on the New York Mercantile Exchange. Brent for June settlements gained 1.1% to $106.07 a barrel on the ICE Futures Europe Exchange. And that's the business we have for you at this time. Don't forget to follow us on social media. Download our mobile app. Take us with you wherever you go. And, of course, watch us on the platforms we are available. This is Business Edge for today. I'll be back 11 a.m. West African time for more African business, the economy, and finance. I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun. Have a fantastic day.